Oh, you got your reward and you're just leaving then?
That's right, yeah.
Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be building my first commissioned project. A replica of Han Solo's reward box from A New Hope. Alright, for starters, everything in this project was either found online for free or custom designed by me in Blender. I'm still pretty terrible at using Blender, and so when I say designed, I just mean mashing models together and cutting with the Boolean tool and hoping it prints. That may be a bit of an exaggeration, but modeling in Blender is definitely something that I know I need to get better at. Anyway, like I said in the intro, this was my first commissioned project. A viewer of mine reached out to me and said that he was building a Millennium Falcon themed room and asked if there was any project I wanted to build to fit within that theme. And because I love the more obscure details of the Star Wars universe, I pitched him the idea of building a replica of Han Solo's reward box. He thought that was a great idea, and so I set to work scouring every possible frame of the box in the film. Here's a few photos that I drew up during the planning stages. Part of my plan was to also include a credit storage container that would fit within the box and be custom designed by myself. I designed the canister using Creative Commons files that I found on Thingiverse. I'm pretty proud of the final result, but I did run into some sizing issues, and we'll talk about that later. All of the larger pieces of this build were printed on my FDM printer, and the more detailed pieces printed in resin at a 0.05mm layer height with ABS-like resin. There was a ton of individual pieces that needed to be filled and sanded, and so I spent a lot of time in this part of the process. But for your sake, we'll skip over that. Even though almost every piece on this build is going to be covered in paint or texture spray and paint, they need to first look like they're made from metal because I plan to do a bunch of chipping effects. So if you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, you know that if I'm painting things to look like metal, I always start out with a coat of semi-gloss black. I'll then move on to using different shades from Vallejo's metal color line to accomplish my metal color. Alright, for the sake of you, the viewer, I'll be telling this story a bit out of order from here on out, and just focusing on one piece of the project at a time. Because I wanted the box to look a bit beat up, before my metal color, I did some pre-scratching. I usually do this before my black coat of paint, but I forgot. Fortunately, it had no effect on the outcome of the metal color. Dry brushing with Vallejo's metal color is great, but when it comes to airbrushing, I still feel like I'm struggling to get the hang of it. It never quite flows out of the airbrush as nicely as I would want it to, and I'm always tweaking my PSI and the amount of paint that I'm spraying to try and get it to lay better. I don't think I'm the only one who struggles with this problem though, because I see a lot of people online talking about how finicky the paint is. My solution has been just to spray a ton of very light coats, and on a big project like this, that's a very time-consuming process, but the struggle is worth it because the end results do look really good. I let the paint dry for about half a day and then covered it in liquid latex. I was roughly using the one auction house photo of the original prop as reference. A quick fun fact, this box sold at auction back in 2012 for $8,500. Anyway, once the latex had dried for about 45 minutes, I shot the box with Vallejo's green-gray model color. I let that paint dry for a day just to be safe and then went back and removed all my liquid latex. I then masked up the stripes on the side of the box and reapplied latex on some existing chips and to add a few more. Once that paint was mostly dry, I installed the feet. After tons of time spent digging on Amazon, I finally found this hinge that was the exact shape that I needed. It was a bit long though, and so I had to cut it down to fit in my lid. I installed this push latch on the interior of the box, and then using a few dabs of super glue, made sure that the latch was located on the lid exactly where I needed, and then secured that in place with screws. Once that was installed, I masked the box up and shot the inside with some truck bed liner. This served two purposes in that it helped fill print lines, but also gave the inside of the box some more texture. I installed the back handle on the box using some 5-minute epoxy and some Allen bolts. With this box being 3D printed, I don't exactly know how strong this method would be compared to the original prop, but because this prop is just for display, I was okay with it not being super strong. I will say that it's strong enough to pick up by, but I definitely didn't do any stress testing. I also used 5-minute epoxy to glue everything else up. Okay, so this part of the build was a bit tricky. I'm pretty sure that on the original prop, this little lip that sits under the lid is actually part of the body of the box and made from metal. But because I had included the addition of this push latch, I knew that I needed this lip to have a bit of give so that it could squish down as you push the lid and unlatch the latch. So for this part, I used some weather stripping that I found on Amazon. And to help give it some rigidity as I shaped it under the lip of the box, I put this wire on the inside. I ended up going with a smaller gauge wire in the end, but this was really helpful when it came to shaping it around all the corners. This was a pretty fiddly process, and it took me a lot of time in the dry fitting stage to make sure that the weather stripping fit nicely around the corners and around the latch. As I worked my way around the lid, I was punching holes in the weather stripping, and then marking the placement of those holes on the lid with a pen. I then drilled holes in the lid everywhere that those markings were, and once I was happy with the way that everything looked, I went back with some long rivets and super glue and glued everything in place. I then masked up the lid and painted the weather stripping with the same green from the rest of the box. Once it was dry, I glued the lid to the box and then added a few screw details around the box. And now that the box is done, let's talk about the credit canister. Because of the way this canister needed to be assembled, I had to first finish these panels and then glue them in place to assemble the canister further. And while I was dry brushing the panels, I figured I might as well do the lids as well. Here I am realizing as I install the panels that I'm actually one panel short. This threw a big wrench in my momentum, since it necessitated me printing another panel, filling it, priming it, painting it black, and then dry brushing. While I was waiting for all those steps on the panel to dry, it allowed me some time to fiddle with the canister. I realized that my canister was almost a bit too wide to fit down into the box, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say, but this is not the only time that I'm going to realize that this canister is too big for the box. But we'll talk about that in a bit. My solution to this first problem was to shave off this detail on two opposite sides of the canister, and then fill it with a bunch of wood filler, sand that, prime it, and sand that again. I'll spare you watching me go through that process, but in this shot you can see that if you didn't know any better, you wouldn't even know that there was a gaping hole there a few hours earlier. Finally, once everything had been glued up, I masked the important parts on the inside and outside of the canister, and shot the whole thing with Rust-Oleum truck bed liner. Using truck bed liner is quickly becoming one of my favorite ways to add just a little bit of visual interest to my props. It's a super quick and easy step, and it fits really well in the Star Wars universe where everything's supposed to be just a little bit grungy and utilitarian. Once that truck bed liner was dry, I shot everything with my final color. I should mention that off camera, before shooting the lids with truck bed liner and paint, I first used liquid mask to cover a bit of the metal color. Here you can see me assembling the latching mechanism for the lids. This mechanism is not my original design, and like with many other things on this project, was found on Thingiverse, but it was super easy to adapt to my needs, and really upped the production value of the entire build. This greebly panel is another great example of what one of my viewers called digital kit bashing, and I really like that term. Like I've said a bunch of times before, I'm a pretty terrible 3D modeler, and I'm trying to get better. But in the meantime, it's great to know that there's a resource like Thingiverse where really talented people post things for people to use for free. I will say, always check the licensing agreement though, because some models cannot be used on paid projects. Anyway, just wanted to say a quick thank you to all the people who post things on Thingiverse. You make my life a lot easier. I said I'd touch on this later, and I'm only just now realizing that I almost forgot. Even though I checked the width of the canister in the box, I did not check the length. and sadly, I was about 6 millimeters too long to fit in the box. Fortunately, my client was very understanding, and we both agreed that it wasn't the biggest deal since both pieces could easily be displayed separately. Alright, the last thing to talk about is the credits. Now, I'll just briefly say, I had to do a ton of sanding on these guys, and as you'll see here, I'm double fisting the sanding to try and go faster, but it was still a lot. In total, I needed 60 credits, 18 of each denomination, and I did 20 just to be safe. I designed this tube to sit inside the canister with slots that would hold all the credits. And to make my life a bit easier, instead of worrying about filling and sanding this piece, I just masked it up and shot it with truck bed liner. Now, going into this project, I knew that if I was going to do these credits, I wanted them to be shiny. And even though Vallejo's metal color line is great, it's never quite polished metal shiny. So for that polished look, I turned to all-clad. I had only used all-clad once before on my Obi-Wan Kenobi lightsaber build, and I got pretty good results, but it still wasn't quite mirror finish. I did a bit of research and decided I'd do a 2K clear coat gloss over a black base, since last time I don't think my gloss black was glossy enough. And as you're starting to see now, the results were really great, and I can't say enough how happy I am with this product. This is only my second time using a lacquer paint through my airbrush, but I'm really happy with the way that it flows, the way that it lays, and everything about this paint just feels so much more superior to a water-based airbrush paint. With each color, I just went back and forth in very light passes, over and over, until I slowly built up that color and that shine. I waited about a day to glue them in place, and then it was on to weathering. If you're a frequent viewer of my channel, you know that I start almost every weathering session off with a black and brown wash. I mix the two colors so that they look like old motor oil and then go to town. You can add more water to your wash if you want a lighter effect, or use less water if you want the effect to be stronger. On this project, I tried out a new technique, which was, after my initial wash, to dip my brush in just a little bit of that wash, and then to pull it back with my finger and flick little droplets all over the box. I then went back and dabbed most of that away so that the effect wasn't so strong. I think this turned out really nicely, and it makes the box look like it's been hit with mud or oil splatters. After that wash is basically dry, I move on to my favorite technique, which is pastel chalks. I mix the chalk shavings with matte Mod Podge and then apply it to every nook and cranny where grime would build up. This technique is really great because you can give your pieces a dusty look if you go light, or you can really build up that chalk powder and give the impression of old, grimy gunk. I say this in every one of my videos, but this is my all-time favorite weathering technique. Finally, after almost 2.5 weeks of work, this box was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. I'm very grateful to be doing my first commission and that I was actually paid to do this work, and it marks a very important point on my journey towards hopefully turning this hobby into a full-time job. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a video every Saturday. And if you're at all interested in having something Star Wars built by yours truly, reach out. My email is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Have a good day.